Good morning. It's good to see everyone this morning. And as we continue in our sort of theme of the way of the emptied Christ, I would like for us to consider a story that is told in several of the Gospels, of the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, and the Gospel of John. It's a story that's told somewhat differently in each one. I'm going to use the story in the Gospel of Mark. And it is in chapter 14, verses 3 through 9. And it is the story about a woman who comes to a dinner and pours oil over Jesus' head. And as we begin this lesson, I would like to invite you to consider a time when the last time you made a mess. Or maybe it was the last time you were involved in some kind of mess. It can be a physical mess, it could be an emotional mess, it could be a work mess, but it's some kind of mess, something that shouldn't have happened, but it did. Or you didn't expect it to happen, but it did. And how you responded to that. I will go first and share a very short, highly abridged story about a mess that I think does have something to do with our text this morning. I have redacted the names, so I'm just going to refer to an important relative. An important relative in my history some years ago had a daughter. This daughter fell in love with a gentleman that she wanted to bring to the relative's house for dinner. So this relative was a refugee from Downton Abbey because the table at this relative's house was always set to perfection. There was a memo one should have gotten before going to that relative's house for dinner, which was, do not come into the kitchen. Do not mess with the table. Sit in the living room and be waited on. Then you will be called to the table and have a meal that has been prepared with the utmost orderliness and decorum. This person did not get the memo. The daughter brought the man to the house, and in an effort to be helpful, this gentleman decided that he would help the relative prepare the dinner, and in so doing began to bring jars from the refrigerator with the beets and the pickles and all of this stuff into this very finely prepared table setting, and in so doing spilled the pickle juice and all of the pickles onto this table. That action transformed an otherwise ordinary Sunday evening meal after church into a nightmare of apocalyptic proportions. The story was told for years after that. The gentleman had no name other than the guy with the pickle juice. But what it illustrates was a moment where a mess was made in a place where it shouldn't have been made, and there were opposite reactions to it. The daughter was like, it's not a big deal. Just clean it up and move on, right? The relative took the opposite perspective, right? That this was a social disaster, right? And so the aftermath of that, which I could do any number of sermons on that, you can just imagine the controversy that ensued, right? But what's important about this story is that it illustrates that when something unexpected happens, particularly when something happens that it's not supposed to happen, then it forces kind of an opposite set of reactions. And the question is, when we are confronted with something that is not expected, what do we do? Well, there's a story in the Gospel of Mark, and I'm just going to read it for you because I think you'll see the application pretty quickly. While he, Jesus, was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, he sat at table with a woman who came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard, and she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. But some there were said to one another in anger, "Why was the ointment wasted in this way? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and the money given to the poor." And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She's performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, and you can show them kindness whenever you wish, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body before its burial. Truly I say to you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." So, you have a woman, you have guests, and you have Jesus. In the Gospel of Mark, the woman is not named, and the guests are not named. And so a woman does this really unexpected thing, and there are two reactions. One is anger. This shouldn't have happened, and if we were going to waste this, we were going to use this ointment, this nard, this oil, then we could have had a much better use than making a mess at the table. And Jesus has the opposite view, right? Why are you troubling her? Leave her alone. She's done a good thing. She's anointed my body for burial before its time. There couldn't be two reactions more opposite than that. One is conscious of the waste and the mess, and Jesus sees it completely differently, as a sacrificial and generous service. And so what's, again, important is that this story, as the text concludes, is going to be told in remembrance of what she has done whenever the gospel is preached. Now, you can't find very many places in the Gospels where you have that kind of a statement, that where this event or this thing happened, it's going to be told in the whole world, right? Wherever the gospel is preached, which means that there is some very deep connection between what's going on here, between this mess, between this event and the gospel. Things happened that shouldn't have happened in this story. You have a dinner party at the home of a leper. I mean, when was the last time you were invited to the house of a leper? I mean, it would almost be like, and I'll insert my name in here, you know, a dinner party at Charles of the COVID. I mean, it sounds so strange, right? This is an unexpected thing, right? This anonymous woman who's not named in Mark, she's named in other accounts, give us an indication of who she might be, but in Mark, no. This aunt pours very expensive nard over a guest's head at a table. What's that about? I mean, can you imagine? I mean, just think about it. You're sitting around a table, or you're sitting, you know, on the floor at a table, however it is that it was done, and a woman comes in, and on the head of a guest breaks open this very expensive container of a very expensive ointment and pours it all over at a table. I mean, sanitary issues aside, all right? This is an unusual thing that's happening, right? The other thing that's not supposed to happen when you give a dinner party, you don't want to make your guests angry. That's not a good party. But the guests respond in anger to this. Another thing that's not supposed to happen, right? Now, one might expect, Jesus to address this event, but the way he does it is somewhat unexpected because he begins to talk about his burial, right? He addresses their concern over the poor, but his real point is the good thing that she has done to anoint his body for burial. Were they expecting their guest to die soon? I mean, did they know this? Did she know this? I mean, it's like, why are we talking about death here? Okay. So when we unpack this story, I want us to start because the story ends with what she has done, right? So what is it that she did? Why does Jesus take such a different perspective on this? Why does this story end with the good news and what she has done will be told in remembrance of her? Let's take a look at the nard, the oil. 3 things about it. It was very, very expensive. The 300 denarii might be the equivalent of a whole year's living wage for one person. It's very, very expensive. The other thing about this nard was that it was aromatic, right? Aromatic nard is something that would fill the room if it were broken, right? I mean, and you can touch base with this, right? Have you ever walked into a room and a person had on way too much cologne or like way too much something, right? It fills the whole room. You can't get away from it. You have to leave the room, right? So not only was it expensive, but it was also aromatic. It also was an attention grabber, but it was also something that was healing, right? This kind of a nard, this kind of oil, would have been used in a medicinal sense. It could have been used in a relaxing sense. And in this sense, Jesus refers to it as something that was going to be done with his body to anoint it for burial, right? So it had a very particular healing quality. So what did the woman do with it? What she did was she showed an extravagant kind of generosity. She had this nard, which they were right. She could have sold it and made a lot of money. It was worth a lot to her personally. But she was willing to give it away. She was willing to give it away, and she showed this extravagant generosity to Jesus, one of the guests. In so doing, she brought about unexpected change in that room. Whatever was going on in that room, as soon as that oil was broken over Jesus' head, the atmosphere in the room changed. Not only sensorially did it change, but it changed because it made the guests angry, and Jesus took the opposite point of view, right? So there was a change that happened. The third thing that happened was that rather than be concerned about what would happen in that room, she accomplished what she wanted. She met the immediate need of a guest. Now, in Mark, the thing that's interesting about Mark is that there is this suspense that happens in Mark when we know who Jesus is because of the readers, because we're a reader, but the people a lot of times in the story don't know necessarily who Jesus is. So what did this woman know about Jesus? Does she know something that we don't know? Well, what matters in the story is that she perceived a need, or Jesus interprets her act as seeing a need, and that is what she met. And she met that need with what she did. I want to argue this morning, I want to present this morning, that the reason this story is going to be told everywhere the gospel is preached is because the actions of the woman demonstrate God's lavish grace. The grace that God pours out on us freely, without reservation. It's not stingy. It's not just a little bit. It is grace. It is his power. It is his Spirit that is poured out on all of us generously, right? And when that happens, things change, right? God is not, and we know this, God is not a stingy God. God is a God of grace, of love, of mercy that has no end to it. There's no zero-sum game here. There's enough grace for everyone and still left over. There's more and there's more and there's more of it. And this is what this woman shows us in the story. Ephesians talks and actually uses the language of lavishness, right? In Christ, we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses, according to the what? Riches of his grace, which he lavished upon us with all wisdom and insight. I want to break the mic. This is so exciting. So the language of interpretation of the writers is that when we talk about grace, we're talking about the riches of God, right? In that day and time, it would be hard-pressed, you'd be hard-pressed to find in an ordinary setting something which, when poured over someone, would picture this more than this jar of really expensive ointment or nard, right? It represents something that is rich, and she lavishes it upon him. We are the what? Aroma of Christ. There it is again. To God among those who are being saved and among those who are perishing. To one, a fragrance from death to death. The other, a fragrance from life to life. Right? This, when the grace of God, when it's embodied in us, and we then have, like the nard, this aroma of Christ, right? Some people are going to like it and some people aren't. You know, some people are going to be really upset by this grace that God so freely gives, right? But others are going to see something different. Others are going to see hope. Others are going to see joy. Others are going to see life, a fragrance from life to life, right? And so grace is not only lavished upon us, but grace flows through us in the same way, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but have you ever thought of yourself as one who represents, who actually embodies, who actually emanates, who shows, who demonstrates, who makes others feel the love of God? There's an old saying, and it's just true. The only Bible that people read may be you, right? When we walk into a room with the anointing of Christ, with the Spirit of God, with God's love in our hearts that we are freely willing to share, right? And I'm not talking about preaching to people, right? That may happen. But I'm talking about how we are with other people. The love of God in us that we allow to flow through us. That changes people. That changes a room. And then for the healing. My grace, as Paul says also in 2 Corinthians, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Grace is all sufficient. God gives us what we need when we need it. The power that we need, the insight that we need, the wisdom that we need, the love that we need, right, is available to us by this rich, lavish grace. Isn't that good news? It's available. A lot of times the problem is that we either don't realize it, we lose connection with it, or we block it somehow, or we don't let it flow through us. But it's still there. Right? It's still there. So, how do we enact God's lavish grace? How do we make this story live in us? One of my favorite philosophers, Emmanuel Levinas, has this great saying, and I mentioned it before in our earlier sermon: to know God is to know what must be done, right? What must we now do, right? What can we do so that this grace flows through us? Well, follow the woman, right? She's the example. Be generous, especially when you don't have to be, right? God has been generous with us. The grace that we have, God's power at work in us, that grace, right? The gifts that we have, the abilities that we have, all that we have, right? God has lavishly poured onto us. We're not going to run out of grace, right? Lest we worry that we only have a little bit, right? We can't use it up, right? Or we won't have any more. Grace, there is no end to God's grace. There is no end to God's ability to forgive. There is no end to God's ability to transform. There is no end to God's ability to enable us to love the unlovable. There's no end to God's empowering us to do what needs to be done when it needs to be done. There's no end to it, right? This is what the good news is, right? It's having to do stuff, spiritual things, and by our own wit and wisdom is over. That game is over. And you see this happen in the story of the woman, because when she breaks the nard over Jesus' head, fills the room with the scent of the perfume, all the people in the room can do, all they know is human logic, which is, that's a waste. That money could be given for the poor. They're not wrong. They just don't see very far. They haven't seen the grace yet. And that's why Jesus says, you know what? If you really wanted to help the poor, I've got to stop talking with my hands. If you really want to help the poor, you can do that anytime you want. You're not always going to have me. You're not always going to have my presence. You will not always have this insight. So listen up, right? Let me tell you what this woman has done, right? Be generous. The second one is be the aroma of Christ in a situation. Be the grace-filled change agent. In your workplace, be the one that's the peacemaker that brings people together. Be the one that goes above and beyond. Be the one who seeks to see beyond the situation at hand that may be very messy. And to how can this be an opportunity for good? You see? Be the person that has the hope when everyone else is negative. Be the person that can stay positive even when things are falling apart around you. Be the one that's willing to go the extra mile, right? Be the person that changes the air in the room. Now, we don't do that because we're so smart we can figure it out. It's not because we have extraordinarily people skills. It's because the grace of God is at work in us. That's the good news of Jesus Christ. God is at work to bring about change, and he does it through us. The last thing. Be an agent of healing and service, not anxious judgment. I think one of the biggest tragedies, and this is not just in our time, but it's all the way through history, is that somehow Christianity has turned into something combative, right? It's used not as wisdom and healing, it's used as a weapon. There is nothing so anti-grace than one's religion and one's belief systems being used to subjugate other people. That's not what it's for, right? That's not how grace works, right? The grace in us is the power to be the change that needs to happen, right? To be the positive person. And I'm not talking about positive as in some sort of denial of reality, right? I'm talking about hope, being a person that's filled with hope that is so needed in the world today, right? Be the person that can bring emotional healing, physical healing, whatever kind of healing that God has gifted you to bring, right? Be that by the grace of God. And so as we think about this story, wherever the gospel is told, this story will be told of her. May it be told of you and me in the world that we live in the environment that we live in the context that we live in, to be the grace, to be the presence of Christ, to be the one who anoints others with the own kind of oil that we have, with the own kind of generosity that God will bring through us, with the own kind of healing, our own kind of expression of God's grace that others need.